This is Al Jazeera.
Hello there, good to have you with us. I'm Jonah Hull and welcome to the Al Jazeera NewsHour live from London. Coming up. Furious protesters break into the US Embassy compound in Iraq after American warplanes strike a powerful Shia group. Red skies and charred earth in Australia as thousands of people are trapped by a bushfire crisis that's spiralling out of control. Seeking justice, Muslim women who were detained in Chinese internment camps say they were abused and forced to have abortions. And as the world ushers in a new decade, we look at the stories that have defined 2019.
I'm Paul Rees with the sport in Doha, where the new decade has just begun. Disappearance of a footballer's father. Colombia's World Cup midfielder demands answers from the head of the country's army.
Iraqi protesters have stormed the compound of America's largest embassy, smashing a main door and setting fire to a reception area. Thousands of people have been rallying in Baghdad's Green Zone, angry at US airstrikes that targeted a powerful Iranian-backed group on Iraqi soil. The US says it was only responding to Iranian aggression and has also blamed Iran for Tuesday's unrest. But Tehran denies it had anything to do with it. The Pentagon now says it's deploying more troops to secure the embassy. We'll be live in Washington in just a moment. But first, this report from Simona Fulton.
Angry and determined, they marched across the river Tigris, through unmanned checkpoints, into the heart of the fortified Green Zone. Thousands of members of the Iranian-backed Popular Mobilization Forces and their supporters surrounded the compound of the US Embassy to deliver a stern warning.
This is a message to Trump and to the American Embassy and Consulate in Baghdad, Erbil and Basra. Watch out, you have touched our soldiers and our brothers.
They set fires at the outer gates as they tried to get inside the embassy grounds.
The situation appears to be escalating now, with hundreds, perhaps thousands of members of the Popular Mobilization Forces having reached to the gates of the US Embassy. They're throwing stones, they're burning trees, they're trying to climb the wall to breach the US Embassy compound, and they're chanting anti-American slogans. They're demanding the withdrawal of American troops from Iraq.
The action is in response to US airstrikes that killed dozens of fighters from the Hezbollah brigades, which form part of the Popular Mobilization Forces. It all began as a funeral procession to honor those killed. Crowds paid their respects as the bodies passed by and vowed to avenge their deaths.
This cowardly act was carried out by the US and Israel. They will pay a high price. We will take a strong stand, and we will not forget the blood of the martyrs as long as there's breath inside of us. We will tell them that we are here on the streets and we are here to stay, and there will be an aggressive response to them. Their bases are not safe.
Top PMF leaders support this march, including Hadi al-Amiri, the leader of the biggest bloc in parliament, and there is Qais al-Khazali, who led an insurgency after the US-led invasion in 2003. They pledged to use both military and political means to expel US troops.
This embassy has proved it conspires against Iraq. This is the embassy where they spy on Iraq and where they lead the destruction of Iraq. This is where the saboteurs are supported.
The US Embassy is located in the heavily fortified Green Zone. For months, Iraqi security forces have guarded it against anti-government protesters, but this time they appear to have orders to stand down. The Prime Minister has condemned the attack on the embassy, but the fact that these crowds have been allowed to reach the embassy gates appears to signal the government's implicit endorsement of the message they are trying to send.
Iran has strong relations not only with the security groups that we talk about, that we've been talking about, but also with the political groups, with the institutions, with state and non-state actors inside Iraq and across the political spectrum from Sunni, Shia and Kurdish groups.
Through loudspeakers, crowds in Tahrir Square, who've camped out for months to protest against the government and Iranian influence, renounced any connection to the group that entered the Green Zone. This attack on the US embassy could turn into a diplomatic crisis. Many fear it could be the beginning of an escalating proxy war between the US and Iran on Iraqi soil. Simona Foltin, Al Jazeera, Baghdad.
Well, US President Donald Trump has discussed the attack with Iraq's Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi. Let's get more on that from Gabriel Elizondo, who's in Washington, D.C. for us. Gabe, what did they talk about, President Trump and Prime Minister Mahdi?
Well, we're just hearing from the White House and confirmation that this phone discussion between the two leaders occurred. And according to a brief readout from the White House, President Trump and Prime Minister Mahdi discussed regional security issues, but also according to the White House, Trump emphasized to the Prime Minister the need for Iraq to protect U.S. property and diplomatic missions within Iraq, but also to protect U.S. personnel as well. That's what we're hearing initially, at least from the White House. This shouldn't be too much of a surprise that these two leaders spoke on the phone because earlier on Tuesday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo also held phone calls with both the president and the Prime Minister of Iraq, stressed basically the same thing, stressing that Iraq needed to protect U.S. diplomatic missions in Iraq and the embassy, as well as personnel. Where does this go from here? From Washington's perspective, I think what you've seen on Tuesday is really two things. Number one, you saw sort of shock that these protesters were able to get right up to the front door of the U.S. Embassy. That's when you saw this fairly rapid deployment of what we think was about 100 U.S. Marines that were already based in the region that were sent to the embassy. We believe that they are there now helping to secure the facility there. So there's an immediate need to protect the U.S. Embassy, but then you're also hearing from Washington also questions on how was this allowed to happen, what security measures were breached, and how were these protesters able to get so close to the U.S. Embassy inside this heavily fortified green zone that you go through multiple layers of checkpoints to get to the U.S. Embassy. So there are some serious questions being asked by not only administration officials, but also Republican and Democratic lawmakers as well, saying they want answers to this moving forward to see what the U.S. needs to do to change any sort of security procedures going forward.
A diplomatic incident is putting it mildly, presumably. What is this likely to do? How difficult is this going to be for U.S.-Iraq relations, two key allies, and a very important relationship in the region for the United States, of course?
Without a doubt. I mean, all of the word coming from the administration on Tuesday was pointing the finger at Iran. Let's be clear on that. The administration says that Iran is behind these protests and that they're holding Iran responsible. However, as you very clearly mentioned, relations between the U.S. and Iraq have been fraying for some time now. And the U.S. has made it very clear that they are now putting a lot of pressure on Iraq to basically make a decision. Are you with Iran, which Iran is a very close, if not the closest ally of Iraq, or are you with us? That us meaning, that's from U.S. officials. Are you with us meaning Washington and the United States here? That's going to put Iraq in a very difficult position, getting pressure from both Iran and from the United States. But clearly you're seeing that this is not going to make the situation between the U.S. and Iraq any easier. We've seen a tweet, for example, from Lindsey Graham, the powerful Republican senator. He basically said, our message to the Iraqi people is this is your moment, he tweeted, to convince the American people if the U.S.-Iraq relationship is meaningful and worth protecting. Lindsey Graham going on to tweet, protect our American personnel in your country. You will not regret it. So very clear words. Those are words, that tweet from Lindsey Graham, really echoing the sentiment from many lawmakers and many administration officials saying, Iraq, you must protect our personnel in the country or else there could be some consequences here. Make no doubt about it, this is now a political crisis between Iraq and the United States, without a doubt.
Okay, Gabriel Elizondo in our Washington bureau, thanks very much for that. And we turn now to Michael Pregent, who's on Skype for us, a Middle East analyst and senior fellow at Hudson University. He's also a former US intelligence officer and military advisor who's served extensively in Iraq. Thanks for joining us on Skype. Many questions to be answered there, as Gabe was outlining. What does it say, I wonder, to you about US influence in Iraq, that this crowd chanting death to America was able to breach at least the outer sort of perimeter defences, what must be some of the toughest defences of any installation or embassy in the world, and supposedly doing it with the acquiescence or connivance of the Iraqi military? A pretty extraordinary set of circumstances.
Yes, there's video. Thanks for having me on, Jonathan. There's video showing the militias. These aren't Iraqi protesters. These are uniformed militias that answer directly to Qasem Soleimani. There's a video of them knocking on the gates, and basically the gates open, and the militias roll in. They push aside a couple Iraqi security force personnel, and they just move in. If you look at the individuals in the crowd outside of the U.S. Embassy compound, two of them are designated terrorists, and that's Qais Khazali and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, the leader of Kataib Hezbollah, the militia that's not only killed Iraqi protesters in Tahrir Square, but is responsible for killing the American at the K-1 airbase. But not only that, attacking an Iraqi airbase and injuring Iraqi security forces. Now, this government needs to decide, is it an ally of the United States in the fight against ISIS, or is it a puppet state of Tehran, specifically Qasem Soleimani and the supreme leader? Because instead of condemning a designated terrorist organization like Kataib Hezbollah, it condemned the United States for selecting a target on the border between Iraq and Syria, where Kataib Hezbollah has been moving rockets and missiles into Syria to fire at Israel. That's the target we selected. We could have selected more controversial targets, but that's the target we selected. Today's demonstrations are orchestrated by Qasem Soleimani. They were facilitated by the Iraqi government. And this militia conglomerate, they represent the largest voting bloc in Iraq's Council of Representatives, the Bina Party. And they decide who the next prime minister will be. They will decide the future relationship with the United States. And they're all trying to pressure the other parties to exit the U.S. based on this attack against Iraq's sovereignty, when the only attack against Iraq's sovereignty has actually come from Iran.
You talk about this being a government that's got to make up its mind where it wants to put all its eggs, if you like. What are its competing interests on the ground? Where are its interests best served, as you see them, with the United States or with Iran?
Well, they've had the luxury of having both. The U.S. has secured $30 billion in loan guarantees. The United States provides training, equipment, money, and intelligence to an Iraqi security force that has been co-opted by Qasem Soleimani's militias. There are photos today of Iraqi security force members vandalizing the embassy. Qasem Soleimani's militias have said we can wear any uniform within the Iraqi security forces. The United States has an opportunity here to tell Baghdad we will stop the U.S. train and equip program. We will not guarantee loans that will help rebuild your economy. And we will show a disfavor campaign towards Baghdad while supporting the protesters. Again, the protesters outside of the green zone are protesting the very same militias that have been killing them that are protesting outside the U.S. embassy. They want Iran out. They say things like Iraq hura, Iran bara, which means Iraq is free and Iran should be out. We need to listen to them. We need to have a disfavor campaign with Baghdad until they arrest people like Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes and make illegal this militia, Kataib Hezbollah. Qasem Soleimani should not be allowed to step foot inside of Iraq. Yet he goes around taking selfies everywhere.
Michael, let's talk about U.S. policy in the region, if we can, for a moment, because the overall sort of U.S. policy of trying to pile pressure high on the government in Tehran with ever-increasing sanctions, trying to force its compliance, doesn't appear to be working. This war against or conflict against Iran-backed proxies is only escalating, and now, as we see, bringing up tensions between the U.S. and such an important ally in the region, Iraq.
I disagree. The maximum pressure campaign is working. This event that's happening now could have happened at any time while we were in the Iran deal, to include under President Obama. If the Obama administration would have targeted Kitab Hezbollah based on the harassing attacks Kitab Hezbollah was conducting against Americans during the ISIS campaign at the onset of 2014 and 2015, we would have seen similar protests. The Obama administration ignored what Kitab Hezbollah was doing. The Trump administration ignored what Kitab Hezbollah was doing until it killed an American, until Soleimani tested a red line. So the maximum pressure campaign is working. We expect to see things like this from a regime that has been doing this for 40 years. Before the Iran deal, there was the barracks in Lebanon, in Beirut. Before the Iran deal, there were the militias that were killing Americans during the Iraq War. Before the Iran deal, there was Lebanese Hezbollah. There's a lot of things that predate the Iran deal. The maximum pressure campaign has made it very tough on the regime to sustain its military activities outside of Iran. And this is simply Iran trying to exert its power over Iraq because they're hoping to offset U.S. secondary sanctions by penetrating Iraq's economic sectors. The United States can hurt Iran by showing a disfavor campaign with Baghdad, telling Baghdad that it will no longer be protected and that the U.S. could start sanctioning Iraq's economic sectors tied to corrupt politicians that favor Tehran over Baghdad or over Iraq. And that's what these protests are all about. Iraqis are saying enough with this. Enough of corrupt Iraqi politicians favoring Tehran over Iraq.
Okay, Michael Pregent, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much for coming on the programme.
This was the fairest.
And still to come on the Al Jazeera NewsHour. Dicing with the traffic, we meet the Colombian teenagers risking their lives in one of the world's most dangerous extreme sports. And exactly 20 years after Vladimir Putin came to power, we look back at 2 decades of Russia's strongman. And brotherly love for the Bucks as the most valuable player in the NBA shocks his own family with his brilliance. Paul will have more later. Unprecedented bushfires are creating apocalyptic conditions in some eastern parts of Australia. In the state of New South Wales, some towns suffered through orange and red haze as bushfires rage out of control. Officials confirmed another 2 people had been killed by fires, bringing the total death toll to 12. Laura Burden-Manley reports.
As a massive wildfire rolled towards the town of Malakuta, 4,000 people fled towards the beach. Those with boats went one step further.
Because now the fire front's come through. Everyone's safe and sound. Got the girls and the dogs up the front. Got supplies, but I've never seen anything like it.
The fire, burning across 730 square kilometres as the day began, encircled residents. It turned day to night. This video was recorded at 9 a.m.
We're just getting some embers flying over now. So they reckon that there's that it's burning towards the northeast at the moment, and it's starting to impact the town of Malakuta about now.
Malakuta is currently under attack at the moment. There's a number of houses we believe is lost in and around that community. We've got 3 strike teams sitting in with the community, literally standing side by side with our community at the beachfront.
Victoria's Premier looked towards the Australia Defence Force for help, while fire bosses tried to calm residents, not just in Malakuta, but across the state.
We've got a number of communities that are actually isolated. And again, this was a scenario that we forecast a number of days ago. So our focus today is very much about how we can get in, how we can support those impacted communities.
In the neighbouring state of New South Wales, scenes repeated. The community of Bermagui camped at the local surf club with the ocean as their exit. And this was in Batemans Bay. During the New Year's holiday, coastal towns are popular vacation spots. Authorities have urged tens of thousands of holidaymakers to go home or cancel their plans.
This is the Batemans Bay Evacuation Centre. The smoke is really bad. It's hard to see with ash. It's apocalyptic. This is in the middle of the day.
Major cities have not escaped the choking smoke and flames. On Monday, 100,000 people were urged to evacuate from 5 Melbourne suburbs. Australia's wildfire season is breaking records. The first major fires started in early September, before the arrival of spring, the product of soaring temperatures, dry ground and strong winds. They've now destroyed more than 40,000 square kilometres of land. At any given time, dozens, hundreds of fires are burning, and the full heat of summer has yet to arrive. Laura Burden-Manley, Al Jazeera.
Well, meanwhile, Australia's largest city, Sydney, has welcomed the new year with tens of thousands of fireworks. That's despite controversy over whether the huge fireworks display should have gone ahead at all as firefighters battle massive bushfires around the city. Flags on Sydney Harbour Bridge have been flying at half-mast for the 12 people who've been killed by the fires so far. 1 million people gathered around the harbour for the dazzling display of pyrotechnics. Well, New Year celebrations have also gone on in Hong Kong, but they've been scaled back. The famous big traditional firework display was significantly reduced due to security concerns. Anti-China demonstrations have dominated the city for months, and many protesters have said they won't be stopped by New Year festivities. Police have used tear gas to disperse crowds marching into central Hong Kong. Florence Louis reports.
Away from the New Year festivities, away from the neon-lit shopping streets of Hong Kong, protesters have gathered here outside a subway station. This protest is to mark 4 months since police stormed the subway station. Images from that day show police hitting people with batons, firing pepper spray. Passers-by were caught up in the violence. Now that incident angered a lot of people here who've accused police of using excessive force. Now, one of the demands that protesters have been making since the start of these protests nearly 7 months ago is greater police accountability. They want an independent investigation into alleged police misconduct. In January, a preliminary report is due by the police watchdog, but protesters say that it's not enough because they deem that agency lacks the independence. Now, there's no indication that the government is ready to meet this demand, and protesters have said they will continue with their push for more protests into the new year.
Well, Chinese President Xi Jinping used his New Year's address to call for stability in Hong Kong.
The situation in Hong Kong has been everybody's concern over the past few months. Without a harmonious and stable environment, how can there be a home where people can live and work happily? We sincerely hope for the best for Hong Kong and its compatriots. A prosperous and stable Hong Kong is the aspiration for Hong Kong's compatriots, as well as the expectation of the people of the motherland.
Taiwan's parliament has passed a controversial law that aims to counter Chinese influence on the self-ruled island. The anti-infiltration bill bans foreign forces from influential activities, including spreading fake news related to elections. Violators face a maximum 5-year prison sentence and a fine of up to $330,000. The bill was pushed by President Tsai Ing-wen's ruling party less than 2 weeks before Taiwan elects a new president. Muslim women formerly held in northwest China's detention camps have accused authorities there of abuse and forcing them to have abortions. As well as Uyghur Muslims, ethnic Kazakhs are also being sent to the camps. In part 2 of our special series, Osama bin Javed spoke to some Kazakhs who say they feel there's nothing they can do to bring their abusers to justice.
On this wall in Almaty in Kazakhstan are the faces of people who were held in China. Relatives say they're being held in internment camps which Beijing calls re-education camps to counter what it calls extremism. Gulzia was held in such a camp. She didn't talk about her experience until after she'd been awarded citizenship in Kazakhstan. She says abuse she suffered has scarred her for life and she frequently suffers headaches.
When I was crossing the border, they saw I am using WhatsApp. I was detained and sent for a thorough medical test. They found I am pregnant and forced me to abort. After the abortion, they isolated me in a clinic. They gave me some medicine which they said was for tuberculosis. I don't know what it was.
Members of the Turkic community accuse Chinese authorities of using abortions as a weapon against Muslims. Other women, afraid to reveal their identities, have also told Al Jazeera about abuse at the camps.
The relative safe haven in Kazakhstan is only for its nationals and does not apply to ethnic Kazakhs who are Chinese nationals. And that's among the causes creating anti-China sentiment inside Kazakhstan.
Dozens of people were arrested in Nur Sultan and Almaty during an anti-Sino demonstration in September. These men crossed illegally into Kazakhstan after they reportedly faced harassment by Chinese authorities. Kaster Musa Khan and Murager Ali Mouli now risk being sent back to China. Activists say events like this fuel anti-Sino sentiment and Kazakhstan should not roll over for its powerful neighbor.
If ethnic Jews are prosecuted massively are prosecuted, for example, in Russia, in Europe, Israel states they will talk against of it. Kazakh government must defend any ethnic Kazakh in the world.
This analyst working with a government-funded think tank says the China-Kazakhstan relationship is a delicate subject.
The Uyghur issue is a domestic Chinese internal affairs, but at the same time, if you take into account the United Nations motions on the Uyghur issue, Kazakhstan's position was quite pragmatic and we abstained from voting on this motion. So we have more independent stance, but at the same time we realize the geopolitical reality. So I believe it's Kazakh-style diplomacy where we try to sustain the relation but at the same time show our case.
Some question why should Kazakhstan oppose China, with which it shares a 1,700-kilometer border, when other Muslim-majority countries support Beijing. Earlier this year, more than a dozen member countries of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, or OIC, signed a statement in favor of China's policies. Commenting on internment camps, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman has said the Uyghur ethnicity is part of the big family consisting of 56 ethnic groups in China, tightly united together like the seeds of a pomegranate. They're living a better life and fully enjoy freedom and rights. China also enjoys friendly and close relations with the vast majority of Muslim countries in the world. Many ethnic Kazakhs say China is violating human rights on a large scale in the name of fighting terrorism. They say their next generation is being killed before birth and their Muslim identity is being systematically erased. Yet they argue there is no leader from the Islamic world standing up to support them. Osama bin Javed, Al Jazeera, Almaty, Kazakhstan.
The main opposition party in Bangladesh has held a rally in Dhaka demanding a rerun of last year's election. At least a dozen people were injured during protests on Monday when police stopped people from marching to the Prime Minister's office. Tanvir Chowdhury was there on Tuesday at the rally.
This is the third day of protest by the United Opposition Alliance and the leftist parties in Bangladesh across the country. Now their main protest is about the 11th parliamentary election that took place on 30th December 2018.
Every day people are facing various kinds of problems and the government is unable to solve it. This government is unelected and illegitimate. They should let go of the power and hold an election through a democratic process.
On 30th December, the leftist party United tried to bring out a procession heading towards the Prime Minister's office, was confronted by the police, and there was a major clash. At least dozens of people were injured and few were even detained.
In Bangladesh, there is no democracy now. The present government is unelected and illegitimate. We all rejected the last election and demand a new election under a neutral caretaker government. Yesterday, police attacked us in a peaceful protest rally. Many were injured, which is why we are here to protest.
For its part, the government is saying they came here with a public mandate. The election was free and fair. Although it's making them nervous, they don't want a united movement by the opposition party against the government right now, considering it has a lot to face with the Rohingya crisis and what's going on across the border in India. Last thing they want to see a political movement in Bangladesh.
Plenty more ahead on the Al Jazeera NewsHour, including breaking bail, the former Nissan car chief who's fled corruption charges in Japan. France's president doubles down on his pension reform plan as he delivers his traditional New Year's address. And knighted for services to his sport. Paul will be here with more on the coach receiving Portugal's highest honour.
Hello, there's some very unsettled weather still across more eastern sections of the Mediterranean. Quite a bit of cloud as well, just streaming in from the north across towards the south, across into Europe. And what we have had is some fog, quite a lot of fog across central regions. And here's some fog in London. This is Richmond Park in West London. You can see the deer here and also a line of cyclists getting their morning activity. But there's certainly quite a bit of cloud in the forecast. Now, Wednesday, New Year's Day, not a bad one at all. 8 Celsius in London. It should be clear. There should be some nice sunshine. 7 in Paris, cooler in Zurich, and we have still got that system working its way not so much through the eastern Med, not onto showers, but really pushing, as you can see, through Turkey, taking the rain and the snow with it, and maybe just 1 or 2 snow flurries into western areas of Russia. More snow across the north there as we head through Thursday, and very little change across much of Turkey, so that snow really beginning to accumulate. It is mild Thursday across the west. We've got the winds coming in from the west. 11 degrees in London, but quite a cloudy day. Meanwhile, northern Africa, those rain showers very slow to clear, really, away from the coast of Libya, you can see here. And also we could well just see 1 or 2 more showers really Wednesday and Thursday into these coastal areas of Egypt as well. So keeping things cooler, but it should at least be dry on Thursday in Tripoli with a high of 16.
Welcome back. Here's a reminder of our top stories on Al Jazeera. Iraqi protesters have stormed the compound of the US Embassy in Baghdad, smashing a main door and setting fire to a reception area. Unprecedented bushfires are creating what are being described as apocalyptic conditions in some of the eastern parts of Australia, where 2 more people have been killed. The New Year's Eve firework display in Hong Kong was significantly scaled back following security concerns over more anti-Chinese protests. The former chairman of car giant Nissan says he fled to Lebanon from Japan to, quote, escape injustice and political persecution. Carlos Ghosn was arrested in Tokyo in 2018 on charges of financial misconduct, but released under strict bail conditions, including a ban on leaving Japan. His lawyer said his legal team held 3 of Ghosn's passports and called his behaviour inexcusable. Ghosn holds Lebanese, French and Brazilian citizenship. Well, Al Jazeera's Mohammed Jamjoom is outside one of Ghosn's residences in Beirut. He explains what the government had to say about his departure.
We now have confirmation from the Lebanese government that Mr. Ghosn is indeed in Lebanon. There was a statement that was issued by Lebanese General Security. It's a very brief statement. It reads, Carlos Ghosn has entered Beirut in a legitimate way and there is no need to pursue him legally. I guess that really puts to bed the question as to if Lebanese authorities are going to be cooperating with any requests by the Japanese to perhaps extradite Mr. Ghosn. Of course, we know now from officials here that there is no extradition treaty between Japan and Lebanon, so that adds to the murkiness around this case. We are indeed right now in eastern Beirut. It's a rainy day. We're in the neighborhood Ashrafiyah. Behind me is one of the houses owned by Mr. Ghosn. We do not know if he is indeed there. There is a bit of a security presence here right now. 1 car from the internal security forces and a few of their police people that are here guarding this house, but there's been no other incidents to speak of out here today. Now, there was a statement issued by Mr. Ghosn's spokesperson in France several hours ago. He had said that he was not fleeing justice, but in fact he was escaping injustice. Now, I'm paraphrasing there. So let me read you a little bit more of what his statement said. Mr. Ghosn said, I am now in Lebanon. I am no longer hostage to a biased Japanese judicial system where the presumption of guilt prevails, where discrimination is widespread, and where human rights are violated. This in total disregard of the laws and international treaties that Japan has ratified and which it is bound to respect.
An Angolan court has frozen the assets of Africa's richest woman as part of a corruption investigation. Isabel dos Santos is a businesswoman and the billionaire daughter of former President Eduardo dos Santos. Assets owned by her husband and a business associate have also been frozen. Angola's government has filed an injunction to recover around $1 billion in funds that are allegedly owed by dos Santos and her associates. French President Emmanuel Macron has called for calm across the nation in his New Year's address. Protests over plans to raise the retirement age have prompted lawyers, teachers and even musicians to strike. Natasha Butler reports from Paris.
It was an unusual protest against the French government's planned pension reforms. Members of the Paris Opera's orchestra played a concert to demonstrate against the proposals.
We wanted to show that our job is to play music, and it makes us unhappy that we've been forced to strike for a month and cancel 45 performances.
For nearly 4 weeks, people including lawyers, teachers, health workers and even ballerinas have demonstrated against the government's plans, fearing their pensions will be reduced and they'll be forced to work longer. The transport workers' strike has disrupted rail, bus and airline services. The French president's been under pressure to break his silence over the protests. In his New Year's speech, he tried to defuse the crisis.
Ne vous y trompez pas.
Make no mistake, on this important subject that's so close to French people's hearts and identity, I hear their fears and anxieties. I also hear many lies and manipulation. Calm must always reign. Calm doesn't mean backing down, but respecting each other's differences. My only compass is and will be the interests of our country.
Macron may hope that his speech will end the protests, but workers at this trade union meeting in Paris said they wouldn't back down. Many of the rail workers gathered here have been on strike since the beginning of December, and they say that the only thing that will persuade them to go back to work and end their protest would be if the government was to scrap its pension reform plans.
We started this strike and we plan to finish it because as long as the government doesn't restore the reform, we'll continue to strike. We are not the only ones.
This analyst says that Macron has failed to convince some people that the reforms are necessary.
Macron has not managed to isolate the strikers because the pension system is everybody's problem. And he hasn't been convincing enough. I think the lack of trust in the politicians' words in France at the moment is very deep. And that's the main problem. When Macron says, don't worry, everything will be okay, you're not going to lose in this reform, people don't trust him.
Macron has a record of pushing through controversial reforms, but this one is proving particularly challenging. The government says the changes would modernise the pension system, make it fairer and save public money. It'll resume negotiations with trade union leaders next week, but with neither side showing any sign of backing down, the talks are unlikely to be harmonious. Natasha Butler, Al Jazeera, Paris.
Russian President Vladimir Putin and his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky have agreed to begin work on a new prisoner swap. The leaders will immediately draw up a list of Ukrainians held in Russia, including those in the annexed region of Crimea, and Russians detained in Ukraine. A date for the exchange has not been set publicly. On Sunday, about 200 prisoners were swapped in the latest sign of warming relations between the two countries. Meanwhile, Putin has just released his New Year's address and has called for unity across the nation.
Our personal plans and dreams are inseparable from Russia because its present and its future, the future of our children, depends on the efforts and contributions by each of us. Only together we will address the challenges faced by our society and our country. Our unity is key to achieving the most ambitious goals.
It's been 2 decades since Vladimir Putin was handed the presidency in a surprise New Year's Eve speech by then-President Boris Yeltsin. He's since brought Russia increased influence in the world, but it appears to have come at a price, as Step Vasson reports from St. Petersburg.
Unpredictable, not making compromises and using swift, decisive moves. That's how Vladimir Putin's late coach described his young pupils' judo skills at an exhibition at his former sports school in St. Petersburg. But Anatoly Rakhlin's words could easily describe the president's leadership style. And even today, in his late 60s, Putin likes to be seen throwing judo champions on the mat, maintaining his image as a strong, fit, macho leader.
The phrase my father said to Vladimir Vladimirovich when he congratulated him after his inauguration was, "Remember, Volodya, it's like sports. When you attack, always remember about defense. When you defend yourself, remember about an attack."
It's a lesson Putin seems to have taken seriously during his 2 decades in power and dominated by his goal to make Russia great again. He's improved the lives of millions of Russians suffering from the collapse of the Soviet Union and provided some stability. But also he went to war in Georgia in 2008 annexed Crimea in 2014 and backed separatists in the east of Ukraine that same year. He's played a decisive role in the war in Syria and has become increasingly involved in other conflicts around the world. Putin's hero, and maybe even his example, is Peter the Great, who in the 17th century managed to expand the Russian Empire through wars and invasions. Now, 3 centuries later, Putin, like a modern-day Tsar, is showing the world that Russia has risen from the ruins of a collapsed Soviet Union. But like Peter the Great, Putin is holding a tight grip on society, and some say his victory has come at a great cost. Yeltsin's decision to hand over the presidency to Putin was a serious miscalculation, says filmmaker Vitaly Mansky, who followed Putin closely during his first year in office and made this film Putin's Witnesses.
Did those people who came up with this successor plan want to create Putin as we know him? Of course not. They were looking for a quiet, non-ambitious executor who would, as Yeltsin said in my film, deal with daily affairs, while important things would be done by important people. This was the scenario. What happened to that scenario we have been watching in the past 20 years. I could not guess that Russian voters would be so spineless and soft to surrender without a fight, not only power, but their own freedoms like that forever.
Mansky's film was never shown in Russia. A growing opposition against Putin's rule has been met with growing repression. But while tens of thousands took part in street protests a few months ago, Putin still has a large army of fans. Growing up in Putin's Russia, these young judo players see the president as a role model. And while he has only 4 years to go until the end of his last official term, Putin's endgame is as unpredictable as his judo moves. Step Fasil, Al Jazeera, St. Petersburg.
Colombian teenagers are risking their lives riding modified push bikes down steep highways surrounding the city of Medellin. It's Colombia's version of an already risky sport called gravity biking. Despite many deaths, riders say it helps them forget their troubles in the crime-ridden hilltop neighborhoods. Alessandro Rampietti met some of the riders.
As night falls in Medellin, a group of teenagers ride their modified bikes down these vertiginous roads. They crouch to increase speed, passing trucks and cars at up to 100 kilometers an hour. Called gravity bikes, they're Colombia's more extreme version of an already dangerous sport invented in the United States. And for many youngsters from poor, crime-ridden neighborhoods on the hills around the city, it has become a deadly pastime. 17-year-old Marlon Muñetón is one of them.
You are always thinking about the risks, people crashing, getting killed, and the serious accidents we all suffer. I know I need to think, chill out, and understand I can kill myself. But we keep doing it because it's our passion.
To go faster, the bikes are rebuilt, often from scratch. Riders personalize them and attach weights to the frame to make them heavier. Pedals and chains are removed to reduce friction. To get to the top of the hills, riders latch onto passing trucks, at times using homemade hooks on a line. Marlon has survived 3 close brushes with death and proudly shows his scars. His friend J.E. tattooed on his belly the name of a cousin who died in a gravity bike accident. The town of La Ceja, on the outskirts of Medellin, has banned the practice outright. 3 of Marlon's riding companions have died this year alone, and serious accidents have become the norm, so much so that the school where most of them study have started safety campaigns and also donated helmets that nobody really seems to be using. The school psychologist says most of the kids come from broken homes and some fall into drug abuse, their bikes becoming a way of demonstrating their value and courage.
If you ask them, they'll say they do it for the adrenaline, the desire to experiment. But the truth is, they are often dealing with depression, parental absence, so it becomes a self-destructive way of escaping from their reality.
Nobody here likes to crash, to fall. nor ruin the bike that was built with so much sacrifice and time. But it's our lifestyle, and we don't have any other safer place to do it.
Marlon now understands he needs to take more precautions, but says he won't be dissuaded. Alessandro Rampietti, Al Jazeera, Bogotá.
A French court has rejected a leading chef's action against the Michelin Guide after he says they downgraded his restaurant for mistakenly thinking he'd used English cheddar cheese in a traditional recipe. Marc Veyrat's restaurant in the Alps was awarded its third Michelin star in 2018, but then lost it a year later. He's been attempting to legally force them to reveal their reasons. Veyrat alleges an inspector mistook saffron for yellow cheddar in his cheese soufflé, which is supposed to be made only with local ingredients. Well, still to come, the sports news, including 3,000 kilometres apart, tennis rivals prepare for a tournament with a difference. Right, as promised, sport now with Paul in Doha.
Jonah, thank you very much. Colombia's World Cup footballer Juan Fernando Quintero has demanded answers from the new head of the country's army. It concerns the disappearance of his father more than 20 years ago. Quintero was 2 years old when his father Jaime went missing in 1995. His family alleged that he disappeared after falling out with the commander of the base where he was doing his military service. That commander was Eduardo Zapatero, who was sworn into the top military post on Monday. Quintero has now asked to meet Zapatero. The case is one of many taken up by Colombia's National Center for Historical Memory, which claims more than 80,000 people were forcibly disappeared between 1958 and 2015.
I join in the feeling and pain of the Quintero family. I want to tell Juan Fernando Quintero that I also respect him, that you are our football idol, and that the doors of my army command are always open for you and your family.
Scottish club Glasgow Rangers have demanded action after claiming that their Colombian star Alfredo Morelos was racially abused by Celtic fans. Morelos was sent off after diving to try and win a penalty at the end of Rangers' 2-1 win. He made gestures to the crowd as he walked off on Sunday. Scottish police are investigating. Well, winning the Copa Libertadores brings adulation in South America, and for Flamengo coach Jorge Jesus, it has now seen him receive a knighthood. The president of Portugal presented Jesus with the honour at the Belém Palace in Lisbon. The 65-year-old Portuguese only took over as coach of the Brazilian team in June, but has become a hero with the fans by delivering long-awaited national and continental titles. English Premier League players won't get much chance to celebrate the turn of the decade. There are 9 more games on New Year's Day. Pep Guardiola's Manchester City host Everton, who as of last week have Carlo Ancelotti in charge. It's the Italians' lowest profile club in some 20 years after spells with the likes of AC Milan and Real Madrid. But Pep thinks Carlo will make Everton great again.
He conducts one of the greatest and more experienced teams in Europe. The list is huge. And when that's happened, it's because you are an incredible manager. So I think it's incredible news for English football. He's back, and he can make an incredible job there in Everton.
Here are those fixtures for you. Arsenal v Man United, probably the pick of the bunch. If you're wondering where league leaders Liverpool are, they play on Thursday. To the NBA, and there was some brotherly love for the Milwaukee Bucks as they ended the year on a high at the top of the Eastern Conference with a win over the Chicago Bulls. Milwaukee's star player Giannis Antetokounmpo was back in action after a back injury. The reigning MVP scored 23, but it wasn't the stats that wowed the crowd. This dunk absolutely astonishing his teammate and older brother Thanasis Antetokounmpo, the man known as the Greek Freak, still managing to surprise his own family. Bucks winning 123 to 102. Plans to slash the amount of time it takes to play a cricket match have been cautiously backed by the sport's founding country, England. The world governing body, the ICC, is looking at proposals to cut test matches from 5 days to a mere 4 after 2023. The English Cricket Board is tentatively agreeing. Test matches have been played over 5 days for the past 140 years, but only a third of matches in the modern game now require a 5th day. The world's top tennis players are preparing for the first tournament of 2020, the new ATP Cup team event, but in very unusual circumstances. World number one Rafael Nadal is in Perth in Western Australia, where he'll lead Spain in their group. 3,500 kilometres away in Brisbane, big rival Novak Djokovic is with Serbia. After the group stage, the teams all head to Sydney for the knockout matches. The tournament begins on Friday and has a $15 million prize fund. Well, the American team took time out from training on Tuesday to meet firefighters in Perth. John Isner and Taylor Fritz thanked members of the service in Western Australia who've been tackling the fires which have devastated much of the country. All right, that is all your sport for now. We'll take you back to Jonah in London.
Paul, thank you. The world is celebrating the dawn of a new decade. Let's take you now to some of the biggest cities welcoming 2020. And one of the first places to celebrate was New Zealand, where a fireworks display was held in Auckland. 500 kilograms of pyrotechnics were used in the 5-minute sky show there. In Shanghai, more than 2,000 drones were flown to create a spectacular light show. The drones formed numbers to count down to 2020 and created patterns in the sky. And it was another towering display in Dubai with a light show and fireworks from the world's tallest building, the Burj Khalifa. Now, it's been a year of protests, environmental disasters, Brexit and Trump. Let's take a look back now at some of 2019's biggest stories.
Demonstrators united in their opposition to a proposed extradition law.
Now is the summer of discontent.
Protesters say has become about much more than a proposed law. It's about the future of the city.
Polls closed on a record-breaking day for Hong Kong elections.
The pro-democracy party secured a record number of seats.
A wave of political and social unrest is sweeping South America.
The usurper they talk about is Nicolás Maduro. Juan Guaidó is the man that challenges his legitimacy.
On Sunday, he was still the president of Bolivia. By midday Tuesday, he was out of power and in exile.
This was how the end of 30 years of rule looked when President Omar al-Bashir was deposed. After 18 months of protest and 4 months of negotiations, Sudan's ruling military junta and the opposition coalition inked a final power-sharing deal.
Protests turned to celebrations at the news of Bouteflika's resignation.
It's not about where your allegiances lie in this deeply divided sectarian country. All walks of life are united against the political leadership.
Panic among the crowds of protesters as gunfire echoes around central Baghdad.
Protesters say they want to live in an independent Iraq, not one that's a puppet of the United States and Iran.
People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
What words, asked the Prime Minister, can adequately express the pain and suffering of New Zealand's darkest day? What words capture the anguish of Muslim communities targeted by hatred and violence?
Carnage in churches on one of the most important days of the Christian calendar.
This is what the end of ISIL's self-declared caliphate looks like.
Assalamu alaikum. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is dead.
The time has now run out.
We've had the opportunity to serve the country I love.
Boris Johnson returned to Downing Street triumphant. The Conservatives have redrawn Britain's political map.
The result was never in doubt.
Article 1 is adopted.
Donald Trump is the third US president in history to be impeached.
It's a disgrace.
Indian-administered Kashmir has been cut off from the outside world. The Indian government has revoked the region's autonomy.
A Nobel Peace Prize winner detained for years by the military, now defending them and herself against charges of genocide.
I accept this award on behalf of Ethiopians and Eritreans, especially those who made the ultimate sacrifice in the cause of peace.
This group is so resilient, is so tough, is just so badass.